how would you define sustainable, and is that a useful term still?
It can be. I mean, I think it's used in the corporate environment as a kind of a greenwash and a frilly thing you put on your annual report. But if you take the word literally, it's a very important word. It's profoundly interesting because it speaks to figuring out a way to exist within an equilibrium, whether it's an equilibrium with the planet, with our resources, an equilibrium between rich and poor. There are a lot of ways in which our economy is not sustainable. And any system that is in an unsustainable sort of orbit or an unsustainable pathway, there will become systemic pressures in that system. And you may not notice them at first. You can maybe put Band-Aids on them at first. But if it's systemic in origin, then you will have severe fissures in that system. And this is, for example, what we're beginning to see with the ecosystem. So sustainable, I think, if you take it seriously as a word and you go to its roots, it's a profoundly interesting word and a profoundly important word.
So how does that apply to some of the clean tech companies that you've been personally involved with or written about?
Right. Well, clean tech to me is a piece of the solution. It's not all of it. It's the technology component of a sustainable economy. And when I speak about sustainability, I typically refer to the subsection of that big word of carbon. I mean, everyone's got their focus. Mine is climate change and its carbon emissions. There's more to it, but that's my focus. And so clean tech is the technology component of a sustainable relationship between the environment and the economy. As people point out, they're not actually distinct, right? That's a mistake we've made. But it's the technology component of a sustainable economy. And to me, it allows us to decouple economic activity from carbon emissions, right? So that we're able to generate economic output and have less carbon embedded in each unit of economic output that goes down over time. So it can be efficiency, it can be low carbon energy generation, smart grid, enabling technologies, a whole plethora of them. But at bottom, it's the machinery that allows our economy to run in a sustainable way. Right? As distinct from, for example, social policy, political policy, financial instruments, and so on. It's the technology piece.
So I had an opportunity to look on your website. There's a clip from the new book, which is Waking the Frog. Which is part of why we alluded to that. Of course, I've got a copy of your old book here, which I very much enjoyed. Kicking the Fossil Fuel Habit, though, talked a lot about the ways in which it's different types of technologies. Yeah. I'm someone who's very, very interested in clean tech, and even I learned quite a bit from flipping this book. But, very accessible with pictures and everything. And it seemed like you were trying to make this information as accessible as possible. But the clip of your new book that's coming out, that's on your website, talks a lot about money. So I want you to try and explain that a little bit. It seemed to me to almost be, to paraphrase it, almost like the argument between Bjorn Lomborg and the Stern Report seemed to be a way to almost summarize that. Do you want to talk a little bit about the numbers and why you don't like using those numbers?
Well, I don't mind using numbers, actually. I mean, to be honest, kick is fairly straightforward because it's an optimistic sense of what's possible. It's a shining house on the hill. If we want to go there, we can go there. I'm making the point as possible. But we're clearly not doing that. And so in the new book, I'm asking why we're not even attempting to go to that house on the hill. We're not even, we're ignoring it. Never mind sort of trying to build it. And I actually do want to talk about numbers because I think economists like Bjorn Lomborg, who use an economic model that comes out of Yale, it's called DICE or RICE, the Dynamic Integrated Model of Climate and the Economy. This is a pretty standard way. Lomborg is sort of only the most public figure, but there are many economists who use that model to sort of say, it's not worth spending money to solve this problem. Just spend a bunch of money on R&D and we'll work the thing out. And I think the exact opposite. I think we should be pouring as much money as we possibly can into actual infrastructure now with existing technology, and innovation will gradually work its way into the system. And I was interested in why we think so differently. I mean, how can I come to the opposite conclusion as Bjorn Lomborg? We're both reading the IPCC report, right? So as a good philosopher, I went to the source of the numbers that he uses, because he's very specific, right? If we implemented Kyoto, we would delay the onset of 2 degrees by, 17.2 months or whatever it is. It's very precise. And that precision indicates a kind of confidence in the truth of that statement. And so I went to the models that he used, and they're garbage. I mean, even the author of the model says, look, this isn't any good past 10 years. The science is dumbed down so much it's near useless. There's no feedbacks in the system or so on. So as a physicist friend of mine said, what's the point of developing complex, climate models? We plug them into dumb economic models. Well, that's what we've done. And so I think the precision that economists use in talking about the costs of action on climate change completely underplay the damage that we face. And, in that model, for example, they dumb the science down, so catastrophic climate change isn't possible. Right? Don't worry about catastrophic change because it's not possible. Everything's linear. It can only go incrementally and so on. So the model just doesn't represent the science. The authors of the model know that. They use a discount rate so that whatever happens in the year 2100, the cost is basically brought down to zero because it's an exponential rate. We all know about exponential curves. So 100 years out, nothing really matters. So the entire world could blow up, but if your discount rate's high enough, it doesn't matter. And that's really what this model does, right? And so that's what I mean by rules of the game. This is a piece of mathematics that's being used with great precision to make very bold statements about what we should and shouldn't be doing about climate change. And the model's garbage. And I get into the details in my book. So I'm not afraid of the numbers. I actually would like to get into the numbers, but I think we need to be a little bit humble about what numbers actually mean, right? There is no way of coming up with that kind of precision. Let's not pretend that we can. Let's think about action on climate change as a kind of insurance policy. So what I do is I say, well, let's just say we want to limit warming to 2 degrees. What does it cost? What does it cost over the next 30 years? Not in absolute terms, because that's scary. Oh, it's going to cost $2 trillion. You know what's going to cost us to limit warming to 2 degrees? It's going to delay doubling of the economy by 2 to 4 years. Something like that. It's a coffee and a donut a day a person for 30 is nothing. And there I'm taking the numbers that the pessimists use in terms of costs. And I can make lots of arguments why it's not going to cost that much. So in very broad strokes, I say we don't know the details, but it's not going to cost an arm and a leg. And we view it as insurance to lower the probability of catastrophic climate change. Because if we get it wrong, we're done. We're done.
I would like you to expand on that a little bit more, because that's something that's been very much part of the climate change debate, quote, in scare quotes, the word debate, of course. But in the media over the past few years has been this idea of if you say it's extreme, basically if you call it anything other than a concern, anything beyond that, and you're an extremist, and that to say things like, we're a climate catastrophe, this is going to drastically change the face of the world, any of those sorts of like apocalyptic language, you're almost immediately dismissed. Can you weigh in on how much trouble are we in? Is that taking it too far to say that we're endangering humanity and society?
We are endangering humanity and society. I don't think there's any, look, the International Energy Agency, one of the most conservative institutions on the planet, has corroborated the fact that we're in for 5 to 6 degrees Celsius of global average warming this century under business as usual. The Pentagon has corroborated that 4 to 6 degrees of warming is the end game of our civilization. They put it in words like, civic structures break down, the international food supplies break down, there'll be international conflicts over water, It's a Mad Max nightmare. These are pretty august institutions I don't think are prone to overstatements. And so, look, go back to 1989 when Margaret Thatcher, right, friend of Ronald Reagan, military hawk, free marketeer, said to the UN General Assembly in 89, it is human life that we battle to preserve. So it has been put in those terms for a long time, and I don't think it's alarmist to put it in those terms. I think we need to speak calmly about the stark nature of this threat, because people just simply don't respond to hysteria, and I get that. But when the International Energy Agency is calling for 4 to 6 or 5 to 6 degrees of warming, and the Pentagon says that's it, I don't think there's anything else to say. I think at that point you just say everything's at stake, and even if we're a little bit wrong, most of it's at stake. So what's the difference, right?
It's that old cartoon that's made its 10,000 rounds on Facebook of the climate science conference, and someone sticks up their hand and said, "Wait, what if we solve all the world's problems for nothing?"
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Clean air, we want the jobs, and we're energy independent, and all that kind of stuff. What I don't like about those arguments where we come up with other reasons why we should do it, green jobs, or a more efficient economy, or cleaner air, they're all true. Actually, those are all correct arguments, but they're straw men. Because there are other ways to achieve economic growth. There are other ways to achieve clean air. There are other ways to achieve energy security. There really are. Fracking, for example, can get you energy security. If you go down that road, you're stuck now arguing on different terms than the ones we want to argue on, which is we have no choice but to limit carbon. We're in a carbon-constrained world now. We don't have a choice about that. What's at stake? Everything. What's the cost? It costs a fair bit, but not too much. When do we get on with it? Now. It's pretty simple. But I think it's hard for the general public, and I include myself I'm a person too. It's not easy to really understand what's coming, because it gives you the cold sweats at 2 a.m, right? It makes you feel frightened. It gives you anxiety, right? It makes you wonder about what happens if the future isn't like today. Does the world really go downhill? These are frightening thoughts. Not to sort of say, yes, I think it's probably true, and then get on with taking your kids to hockey and living your life. That's what we do, and I get it. But to really understand it here, that's difficult. So, and that's why I think this is such a tough road to hoe.
So explain, you make that comparison to World War II and mobilizing this effort, and I want to give you an opportunity to talk about green bonds as well, because I know that's something that you were pushing as well, this idea of a war bond type idea to solve this problem. So maybe you can sort of answer that in two parts. But specifically with that, we haven't seen that. We haven't seen the mobilization yet in that sort of external threat. How do we mobilize that? Is it really going to be possible to mobilize that action? Like you've demonstrated already that we have done this before. Yeah. How do we make it happen this time on this issue?
Yeah, the difficulty here is that the enemy is a very abstract thing, right? And it's also a 40-year time horizon before you get any results from what you do. Like we could cut carbon to zero tomorrow, the world is still going to warm for another few decades, right? The cycle is so long. My real worry, and I'll get to green bonds and war footings in a moment, but my real worry is that the skeptics on action and those who are deeply concerned about climate change like me actually agree on something. It's kind of too late now. Climate change is coming. We're just trying to make it less bad. And we don't really know how much less bad we can make it because there's a lot of momentum in the system. So my response is all hands on deck. Right, and I talk in my new book about the kind of industrial output that the United States switched to when it got serious about World War II, the number of tanks it produced and so on, because it said this is a priority. And overnight, the industrial might of the world's most powerful nation got to work. And if we did that now, with the innovation and the financial capital that we have in the developed world and the manufacturing capacity we have in the developing world, so I got those backwards. The innovation and finance of the developed world and the manufacturing capacity of the developing world. We can do it. There's no question in my mind that we can do this, but we just have to take it extremely seriously, and it has to be the fundamental focus of industrial civilization. That's the kind of reaction that's required. How do we do that? Well, that's the $1 trillion question, right? I mean, I think the first thing we do is we have to understand why we're doing it.
It's literally the $1 trillion question, as you were outlining in that chapter that you had prefaced. Do you want to get a little bit about that? You talked about what you get for $1 trillion.
Yeah, well, first of all, let me just note that $1 trillion is nothing to the fossil fuel sector, right? So let's not pretend we don't already spend, I don't know, between now and 2030, we're planning on spending something like $20 to $25 trillion just to keep our existing infrastructure going and meet, fossil fuel demand. So let's not pretend we're not going to spend dozens of trillions anyway. So, what do you get for $1 trillion? Well, for $1 trillion of enhanced geothermal, you could replace the entire U.S. coal system. So, renewables are perfectly capable of stepping up to the plate. It's a myth that we need to blow the tops off mountains and extract coal and melt tar to power our civilization. That's the point of kick, right? That renewables are not the kids' party at the energy game anymore, right? The kids' table at the energy party anymore. They're all grown up and we're ready to play with the big boys. What we need is the capital that big boys play with. So if you want to compare apples to apples, that's why I asked the question, what do you get for $1 trillion? Not to point out how big $1 trillion is, but to point out, hey, if we're playing on the same field, guess what solar can do? Guess what wind can do? Guess what enhanced geothermal can do? Guess what the smart grid will do? And that's the kind of questions we need to be asking so that we at least see it's possible. Then we ask questions like, where is the money and how do we get it deployed into that sector? And that's when things like price on carbon comes in, green bonds come in, pension funds. Pension funds are sitting on trillions of dollars of cash. And if you can build projects that generate a return, even a low rate of return, that's where pension funds want to put their money. And they're the only institutions on the planet that I'm aware of that have the same kind of time horizon as climate change, right? They've got 30 and 40-year commitments to their constituents, to their sort of benefit holders. Well, that's exactly the time frame in which you get a benefit in the atmosphere from reducing carbon, 30 or 40 years. So pension funds is where the capital lies. Price on carbon is how we unlock it. Green bonds is how we accelerate it. And we move capital into this sector at the same scale as we have it moving into the fossil fuel sector. That's how we solve this problem.
You can either answer green bonds part of it first or address this first. But it seems to me the only part of that you left out was that it was government. And there's a lot of conversation in the business world about they can't plan for their future unless they know what government policy is going to look like. So whether or not we're going to do things like tax carbon. Yeah. But what I want to ask you about is in Canada, in this example, I think the best you could say with a straight face was that the federal government does not have a terribly serious plan for climate change. I think that's the most generous way that you could possibly phrase it. So when you have an unresponsive government, how does business mobilize to deal with this, even once you've convinced them?
Well, I think you sort of have to think about the global economy, right? So the way I think about clean tech, so I play on the technology side, right? The rest of the world is going to decarbon. The world is, whether Harper gets it or not, there's a market. There's a market now. There is so much low-hanging fruit that we can go after. Let's just get busy with that, right? We have a mountain to climb. The last 2/3 of that mountain, we need a price on carbon. The first third, we don't. So let's pick off the first third. That's going to take us 10 years anyway. So let's get on with it. And in our fund, for example, we invest in companies that have a value proposition in the market today with no regulatory or policy change. That's our fundamental investment thesis, right? That we can beat fossil fuels at their own game without subsidies. And there are technologies that can do that. But you're only going to get so far in this big global market. So if you think globally, the rest of the world will be climbing those last 2/3. We just don't really know when, right? So patient capital can still go there.
While we're talking about what people can do, of course, we said we're not going to talk too much about Planet Traveler because I know you've spoken about that quite a bit in the past. But using that as an example, you've had your own project where you tried to have a sustainable and ecologically friendly and alternative energy and all full of neat gizmos and all that sort of stuff. Talk about what people can do maybe for their homes or for their businesses to replicate that model.
Right. That's a very practical question. So what we demonstrated with Planet Traveler, this is the first third, right? The mountain we got to climb, the first third is not hard because you get economic return for doing a good thing. Well, Planet Traveler demonstrated that, you can reduce your carbon in a building by 75%. You can make a profit doing it. I mean, it's a commercial building, so it's a bit easier than a house, but it's the same principle. Geothermal, LED lighting, solar thermal for the hot water, bit of solar PV, good insulation, yada, yada, yada. And we reduced our carbon output by 75%. And our energy savings are so big that without any subsidies, we're cash flow positive because that energy retrofit was essentially like a mortgage on the building, and my mortgage payments are less than my energy savings. It's a no-brainer. We're wealthier as hoteliers for having made those retrofits, not poorer. So my point in doing that to that building is like that model of 75% reduction works for almost every commercial building in this country. And everybody who did it would be wealthier. So the question is, well, why isn't everybody doing it? Well, because people look for 9 to 12 month paybacks, right? Commercial building owners anyway. I got about a 4 or 5 year payback, right? That means in 4 or 5 years, the system's free. And, unless energy is a concern of yours, you consider it your core business, you won't spend your capital on it. You'll put it into your operating budget, not your capital budget. And your operating budget turns over every year. You need a 12-month payback, roughly speaking. And not much stuff gives you 12-month payback. Some does, but you can't do those kind of cuts with 12 months. So if a CFO saw a line item on their income statement that said energy and said, well, that's core to my business because I don't want to be exposed to rising energy price. I want to mitigate that risk. I just want to bring that cost down so I can use that money somewhere else. It's core to my business to bring that down. Then they would make the changes that we've made in Planet Traveler. But until they think that way, they won't, right? It's just a line item, cost of doing business. It's from my utility. I can't really change it, right? Well, I'm motivated because I'm worried about carbon. You can change it. That's the point I'm saying. That line item, and these buildings are, $1.5 million a year. You could make that $300,000 if you decided to, but you have to decide to. That's just psychology.
So we've talked a little bit about that first 10%. You mentioned that a few times. Something we've spoken about on my radio show a few times recently, and I'd love to get your perspective on it, was we've been talking about good uses of energy from the environmental community, quote unquote. If there is that 10% that needs to be attacked first before we can go forward and take care of the rest of those steps, is there anything that comes to mind for you that you think people are maybe misusing their energy, either fighting for or fighting against, because at this stage it has nothing to do with something that has to happen first? Wastes of energy within the environmental community as far as projects and fights and that sort of thing.
Well, I don't look, people have their own concerns and their own lens, and I don't want to take away from anybody else what is legitimate concern about recycling or whatever, right? Those are legitimate concerns, water use and so on. But in my mind, if you're not dealing with carbon, you're not playing in the big leagues. Because if we don't solve the carbon problem, nothing else matters. Because I don't think that's overstating it. So in Ontario, for example, people who get upset about water use, I said, well, really, I know it's good not to waste water, but why do we really care? We have a lot of water here. And they would say, well, it takes a lot of energy for the city to run their water plant. Yeah, it is. There's a lot of energy in the city. But as a percentage of the energy used by your house, including that energy, your share of that energy from the water plant, it's nothing. It makes us feel good that we're saving water, but I don't think it's relevant in Ontario to save water. I think it's relevant to save carbon. But I don't want to take away from the good intentions behind that.
Okay, so tell us a little bit about the Green Bonds program. I know that's something you were involved in starting, and now it's been going on for a few years. So tell us what it is and then how it's been doing.
Sure. Well, at core, it's a very simple idea. The government backs a bond, like a Victory Bond or Canada Savings Bond. The public buys them, and the money is deployed as low-cost debt for renewable energy infrastructure. And the cost to government is minimal because, you put the money into projects that generate revenue that pays the cost of the bond. There's details. I think the private sector should be doing the due diligence and so on and so forth, but that's the core idea. You're generating a lot of low-cost capital to make sure that renewable energy projects, whose primary cost is the cost of capital.
So give me a quick idea for, say, just give me an example being me. I have, say, $500. What would happen to that $500?
We would go into a pool of money, along with a lot of other people's $500, and that money would be lent to someone, say, who's building a high-voltage DC line up to Hudson Bay to open it up for wind development or something. And then the wind power that gets developed in Hudson Bay, because that's some of the best wind resources in the country, that could beat coal hands down, but it needs a way to get to market. And so they would pay to put that power down that high-voltage line, and the payments they make for that line would pay the bondholders like you.
Right, so it's a government-backed loan at its core.
It's a government-backed loan at its core.
Just finally, I want to ask you a little bit more about your upcoming book as well. But the last thing I wanted to ask you was about the Green Energy Act. That was a internationally celebrated policy. It was heralded as something that should be copied worldwide. How, in your opinion, has that been going for the last few years? And is this still something we should be celebrating, building on it?
Well, the Green Energy Act is better than nothing. There's nothing that can beat a price on carbon. So if you're comparing it to what should be done, we should put a price on carbon and be done with it. We're not doing that, so the Green Energy Act is a decent first step. It's training wheels. I mean, I think in my mind what it does is it gets Canadian industry and Canadian finance familiar with and able to deal with renewable energy projects. It gets some renewable energy projects built, but I think what it really does is it primes the machine. In terms of economic benefit to the province, though, I think the real benefit comes from innovations that are now emerging to deal with the kinds of instabilities that our grid has now that we've introduced this much variable generation. Even if it's not on the grid yet, people are thinking about it. So you have, high response energy storage, a company called Temporal Power, flywheels. You have sensors, smart energy instruments, so you can see the distribution grid and the two-way flow of energy now that you've got solar panels on roofs and so on. So we're beginning to build the smart grid. And it's building the smart grid where I think Ontario has a real chance to play internationally and really develop some high-quality jobs. We're great networkers. We know all about engineering. We built one of the best power systems on the planet. It's a little creaky, but as we upgrade our own system to accommodate what the Green Energy Act brought to the table, we're going to reignite, I think, our engineering and our finance community, our venture community, into building world-class companies that are solving problems now that the rest of the world will be solving tomorrow. And I think that's going to be the legacy of the Green Energy Act, not the wind farms or the arguments about wind. It's going to be the upgrades to our grid and the innovations that came out of those upgrades.
So kicking the fossil fuel habit had a lot to do with what we could be doing with that money if you were able to develop those investments and maybe either that through government-backed bonds or however the money, the capital got located. What is more Waking the Frog more about? Is this the continuation? Is it part two? How did you go with the new book?
Kick is an optimistic expression of the possible, and Waking the Frog is an articulation of our inaction. Right, so it's a much more pessimistic book. There's no pretty pictures in this one, but it's a much more serious book. I mean, it's really saying we need to look really hard in the mirror and ask some very hard questions about who we are and what kinds of systems we've built, political and economic systems that we've built, and what are the responsibilities of our business community. And there are difficult answers to those questions, I think, because they're not positive answers. We're frozen, we're locked for lots of reasons. But I think in asking those questions and understanding why we're paralyzed, why can't the CEOs of our biggest companies talk about climate change in public? Why can't our fossil fuel sector acknowledge publicly climate change? They say it's true, but they're not speaking in terms of alarm. There are civic leaders. They have children too. And I think anybody who looks at this, who's looked into the kitchen, And anybody who's read the International Energy Report or the Pentagon Report, and all these people have, you know what's up. And so why aren't we saying anything? Why aren't we having an adult conversation about climate change? Well, there are reasons for that. So I think we need to ask those questions, look at ourselves hard in the mirror, and wake the fuck up.
Okay. Thank you so much for speaking to us today, Tom.
You're more than welcome.